And honestly, here's another one that we use often as well is archives. Like I have had so many phone calls with like the sweetest old ladies who work every Tuesday between 2 and 4 p.m. at this tiny little library in this tiny little Midwestern town. And they only have enough money to pay her for like 2 hours a week because that's all the money that like the municipality has given to this library and this archive to pay this like little old lady to do it. And it's like, I need information on the following case.
Welcome to Needle Stack. I'm Aubrey Byron.
And I'm Shannon Reagan. Today we're talking to MJ Banias. MJ is a journalist, writer, and investigations lead at Permanent Record Research. MJ, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Before we start off today's show, I'm going to give a slight content warning. We'll be tackling some of the not suitable for work subjects and how they relate to OSINT. Just an FYI, so if your environment isn't conducive to that, for some reason you have little OSINT kiddos running around in the background, maybe bookmark this, save it for later.
This is the After Dark episode of Needle Stack.
Yes, Needle Stack After Dark.
It's been coming for a long time.
If it wasn't 11 a.m., maybe I would have a cocktail.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, so MJ, on that note, you wrote about how one of the most basic human nature needs, the drive for sex, can be a big OpSec liability and a gift to OSINTers. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So I wrote a post for a blog called Bullshit Hunting. It's an interesting little space on the internet where we sort of wax poetic and discuss sort of interesting issues are in the OSINT investigation space, forensics, analysis, all of that. And one of the pieces I decided to write, or a story I decided to tell, was an investigation I was working on a while back regarding just tracking an individual down, kind of the usual stuff. We had a client who needed to sort of identify somebody, and it's all in the blog, so I'm not going to go over it at length. But the key piece of the puzzle that allowed me to locate this individual was an email account that they used to create an account on a popular service called Adult Friend Finder. And for all of the uneducated, or all of you who live under a rock, Adult Friend Finder is basically like a hookup site. So if you're, having a lonely night, feeling thirsty, you can create an account on Adult Friend Finder, and essentially, I feel like there should be like music in the background at this point. We should have like a right. We'll put some pornographic music overlay here. But Adult Friend Finder, you can essentially create an account and find other people who are in a similar situation, who are looking to get lucky, and hook up. It's there's criticism on the service. They say there's a lot of bots and that type of stuff. But regardless, I was looking for an individual, and an email that I had sort of discovered regarding this person popped up in a data breach of Adult Friend Finder. And with that, I was able to locate this individual's profile, which then led me to a whole bunch of other selectors that were quite useful in eventually sort of identifying this individual, de-anonymizing them, and then sort of subsequently handing that all off to the client for their own kind of use after our job is done as OSINTers. But yeah, that's the sex is what got in the way for this individual, and their need to have it on some, lonely night in 2021 or something, whatever it was.
Well, there are a lot of lonely people out there. I think I kind of came into this bullshit hunting article, which, by the way, I am a super fan of bullshit hunting. I love this newsletter publication. It is great for OSINT tips. I think it is also just one of the most cleverly and interestingly written OSINT pieces out there, like OSINT educational pieces out there. So highly recommend. But I came into it from an article you wrote in the Debrief that was about the OpSec fail of the South African Parliament, and then maybe also of the deep personal needs and thirstiness of MPs. Could you speak a little bit about what happened in that case, and similar, involvement of personal email addresses and what that unfolded into?
Sure. Yeah. So I can get into that. This was a tip I received from a friend, and he kind of pointed. He sort of showed me a report that was written by a group called OSINT Industries. And if you're sort of in the OSINT world, you've probably seen them rolling around LinkedIn and Twitter. OSINT Industries is very similar to sort of Epios. I really like OSINT Industries. It's like you can punch in a phone number or an email, and it starts running through various modules, essentially, and pulling data out of it. So it's a very useful, handy kind of like web browser version of a sort of a search, a database search. And they wrote a report concerning the South African, essentially members of parliament, and how the South African government website for those members of parliament published, these are our members of parliament, and put in photographs and email addresses and phone numbers. The kicker was that a lot of those emails and phone numbers were actually personal emails and personal phone numbers. So they weren't like designated like at ministry.sa.com or anything like that. Like it wasn't a sort of a specific sanctioned government email. It was like, jsmith@gmail.com. And they were just like their generic kind of emails they use for day to day, as well as phone numbers. So what OSINT Industries did, and what I talked about in my article, was how they essentially started running all these emails and all these phone numbers through their system. And it started popping out that a lot of these email accounts were used to create accounts on Pornhub and other sort of pornographic video services. There was no adult friend finder, which was, a great sign for the South African government. But, there were a lot of links to like I said, various kind of tube pornographic streaming sites. So you have essentially this interesting kind of operational security risk where, you would be able to identify which, members of parliament are utilizing these sites, and then or their emails are utilizing these sites. And then really, if you wanted to dig in here, right, you could potentially start trying to comb through some breach data, potentially combing through other kind of repositories of passwords and that type of thing. And you could really get to know somebody really well based upon their sexual proclivities in Pornhub. So I'm just saying, again, operational security wise, this is kind of a really sticky situation. And I guess it depends on the MP, depends on their political leanings. There's like a whole mess of issues that could arise here, especially for like oppo research in politics and that type of thing. But moreover, like beyond the pornographic stuff, there was like there was accounts on a whole bunch of other services, and a lot of them were like fitness and wellness services that literally track like GPS location and steps, and like running apps that track like your location as you run through a park and that type of stuff. So again, from an operational security perspective, you have all of this data that's just sitting out there on a government website that anyone could just start kind of scraping through and essentially like really pick out interesting details regarding a possible target that you've been hired to acquire or collect information on. And yeah, it's also just kind of sitting on a government website.
I wanted to ask you about that because I did pick up that Strava was used in that South African Parliament investigation. And yeah, I'm a cyclist, so I'm very familiar with Strava. And I think maybe hyper aware of when it gets used in cases like there was the assassination of a Russian commander, where it led to a break, and then kind of the like famous case of people being able to map U.S. military bases based on the running habits of soldiers using Strava. But I never really see it kind of on lists of like OSINT resources. I feel like it could be an underutilized, or maybe it's just so creepy that people don't want to use it.
Yeah, I think it just depends on your target, right? I mean, if, it's not often, like, and I'll be honest, like I've done a few investigations and very rarely has Strava ever popped up as like a tool to use. And typically it's because I think a lot of OSINTers generally investigate are like, avid runners or cyclists. They're a little more maybe like reclusive. They're not out there pounding the pavement at 6 a.m. every morning, getting their steps in and any of that. That's so I don't know. Does it have like, is Strava good to use? For sure, but only if the individual you're going after has a Strava account. Yeah. After that, it's like, well, who cares? But yeah, I don't know. Maybe people just don't run.
After really fit members of parliament. Maybe check.
That's right. Yeah, like your target is like super fit, right? Like a very healthy person. As I drink my Coca-Cola, right? Just like that.
Should we take a moment and talk about your Coca-Cola endorsements?
Listen,
I feel like
Coke Zero.
That's one thing I learned about you from reading your writing is I think you might have a Coke Zero addiction.
Yeah, I do. Listen, Permanent Record Research nor bullshit hunting has any affiliation with the Coca-Cola Corporation. Like, we do not. Like, they're not paying us. We're not, I haven't received a free case or a coupon or anything. It's just, it is a fine beverage. So, if you want to be a great OSINTer, Coke Zero is your friend. No, it just tastes really good.
Send the cases.
That's right. I'm not sure. Do we have to Greek it like in movies, right? You have to like cover stuff so you can't see the logo. It's called Greeking. I don't know, but
we don't.
Yeah,
we don't have that post-production budget.
Oh yeah, I have to blur it out every time I take a sip.
Back to maybe the icky factor you talked about. Maybe not wanting to dive into someone's Strava. You also mentioned breach data, which I feel like is one of those litmus tests in OSINT. It's incredibly valuable. I think that's undeniable. But when do you kind of decide when and if to use it or even just go poking there?
Yeah, it really depends on the client, right? So whenever we engage with a client and they give us tasks, right, to perform, if we're very clear and be like, okay, what are sort of the rules of engagement here, right? Because at the end of the day, who is this report for? Who's essentially going to be potentially the final client? Is this going to end up on the front page of a newspaper? Like, what are the steps that we have to follow as the researchers here? And your clients are very, very good at, clients are very, very clear and listen, these are the rules you have to follow. You cannot do the following things. And often, not often, but sometimes, right? They'll be like, listen, breach data, for example, or leaked stuff is not, you can't touch it. We don't want any part of that, just in case, this has to go somewhere else or be presented up a chain, or again, it could look bad. So it's totally based upon your client here. So that's kind of all that's the only response I can really give. If I'm going to be doing something sort of from a journalism standpoint or, investigating certain things, so for example, in the case of this individual I was going after, and I found their stuff in an adult friend finder leak, we had clearance that, you're allowed to use sort of any means necessary to find this individual, versus other situations where you're not. So yeah, I think it's kind of, it depends. That's my gray answer to your gray question of just it
That's
depends.
Okay. It is a gray matter.
It is.
Well, you did mention something, newspapers, and you do come from a journalism background. I was actually reading, I think it's your latest bullshit hunting article that was on kind of tracking the whereabouts or, handoffs of this particular vase.
Yeah.
And it was, it happened in the late 90s. You were using kind of the internet to locate people that might have come in touch with it or touch with buyers. And sort of as an afterthought, you're like, oh my God, newspapers. Do you think that OSINTers kind of have this blind spot, in all of the online investigations that they do of using newspaper archives?
Yeah. And here's there's actually, I literally had a conversation about this yesterday. I think in OSINT, we have this really kind of ingrained concept that tools and coding and utilizing sort of incredible computer software to do the work, to streamline it, to automate it, that's become a big part of this game. Right? It's become a massive part of how OSINT is done. And, a lot of people coming into OSINT now, they have a background in some coding. They have a background in aspects of cybersecurity or hacking. They have that kind of computer know-how to kind of go out and just scrape vast amounts of data. And the big companies out there that are making millions of dollars selling OSINT toolkits are essentially kind of selling this product in different markets, right? We're able to go out, scrape a whole boatload of data, and then, compartmentalize it for you to make your investigations easier. And that's a huge chunk of the OSINT industry. And that's great. Some of those tools are amazing and they're useful. The problem is they start to really fall apart when you start moving back in time. right? Like if you need to start looking at data that starts to kind of appear before the sort of internet became a large thing where people were all over the internet and that type of thing, you're starting to kind of, that toolkit becomes a little less useful, and the kind of the classic kind of investigatory gumshoeing becomes more useful, right? The ability to just go out and think about these problems in ways outside of a computer. Like, okay, I can't find any of this information in data scrapes. So how do I now go about finding information about whatever I need in kind of more traditional kind of investigatory ways? So newspaper archives, in this case, in particular, when I was trying to find a vase that had sort of vanished from an investigation, finding the vase I knew would be like, this is not going to happen. Like, this vase does not exist on some like eBay or anything like that. This
No
thing's
current
gone,
listing. Yeah.
most likely, right? Like, this thing has most likely been smashed and is sitting in a landfill. Or it's like in some like old lady's attic, and she bought it at a yard sale in like 1997, and it's been there ever since. And just right. And like, she keeps her pens in it or something.
It'll be on Antique Roadshow.
Ooh, yeah.
Right, exactly. And there's gonna be that moment where I'm watching Antiques Roadshow in like 5 years, and it's like, oh my god, there it is! Holy shit! And you know what I mean? But sorry, I said shit on your show. Is that okay?
We already did the disclaimer. It's fine.
Great. So I started looking not for the vase itself, but for people who potentially would have worked at sort of the shop, the antique shop that it was sold to, kind of after this incident occurred. It was a homicide, basically. And what I didn't find was the vase, but what I did find was the antique shop being featured sort of multiple times in the 90s in kind of local newspaper articles. And the journalists, there's I think two of them who kind of covered, like throughout sort of the mid 90s, covered this antique store for like a community, like antiques are all the craze, like that kind of thing. They interviewed other employees at the store. And there's like photos of them like posing with like, I don't know, some, cabinet, like plate fancy thing. It's like, oh, look at this, and you have these photographs and these names of employees. So now all of a sudden we have people who would have been in that store employed at the same time that vase was in the store, bought and sold and whatever. So we essentially had now a couple names that we could go after and say, okay, we knew they worked there because their pictures in the paper and they were interviewed. So now we need to talk to them and see, do they remember anyone else they worked with? Right. And it's funny. They do. Right. People like stay in touch. They're like, oh, yeah, there was Greg. You should talk to Greg. He knew everything. He was the gossip of the store. If that vase is somewhere, he knows it. Like, that's kind of what it was. So you'd reach out to Greg, and then Greg would give you another name. And you would start kind of building out this kind of web of individuals who potentially would have been near that vase at any given moment through sort of history in that store.
There's so much picking up the phone also in your stories that I think would just make any millennial just like crumble into a pile of dust, like between that and like reading newspapers.
Right. And it's so funny. I do call people like, and again, this becomes a matter of the rules of engagement. So a lot of our clients, for example, say, no, you don't talk to anybody. This is all passive, right? You don't tell anybody what you're doing. In this particular case, it was the rules of engagement were like, don't call people, but give us their contact information and we will call them. And if we need your help, we might have you speak to them because this a little more intimately. So if we have questions, we might just connect you. So there was like one or two moments where I spoke to people about this phase and just kind of asked like very direct questions, like, we know this, we know this, we know this, we don't know this. Do you have this answer? So typically rules of engagement apply here. But there have been cases for sure that I've worked on, as well as stories that I've worked on as a journalist, where you definitely have to just randomly cold call people and be like, hey, are you this person? And that's how you get a lot of your intelligence.
Well, I have to tell you, as someone who also came from print media, you love to hear it. OSINTers, maybe a local news subscription is the key to your investigation.
Crack that case.
you figure out where stuff is, and you just start looking at the local papers in that town. And then, and honestly, here's another one that we use often as well is archives. Like, I have had so many phone calls with like the sweetest old ladies who work every Tuesday between 2 and 4 p.m. at this tiny little library in this tiny little Midwestern town. And they only have enough money to pay her for like 2 hours a week, because that's all the money that like the municipality has given to this library and this archive to pay this like little old lady to do it. And it's like, I need information on the following case, right? It's like, it was a shooting that occurred in 1986 in this town. I know this local paper covered it, or would have covered it, because it would have been a big story back then. These are the names of the people involved. Can you find it? And she's like, oh, dear, I'll go track that. And sure enough, 2 days later, I get an email with just like PDF files of like newspaper articles that this like sweet old lady literally scanned into a scanner and sent me. And so for sure, right? And suddenly you have more piece of this puzzle, right? You now have this individual's like mother's name, for example, because it was featured in the article. It's like, okay, there's another selector that we can hunt down and go after. So archives, newspapers, these are like the best when it comes to OSINT. And it also makes you feel like you're doing something real, right? Like, you're not just sitting at a computer punching in stuff into like domain tools and it's feeding you all this data, right? You feel like, yeah, I'm like in there with a paper in an archive going through like old like tapes.
I gotta call Marge. Like, I gotta get back to Marge.
Yeah, it's old school, and I kind of dig it. But it does help at times, especially if your clients have sometimes clients have like some really weird asks, and you're just like, sure, we'll try to figure it out.
Whenever we first meet guests who come on the show, we always ask them about their OSINT background.
Sure.
I have to say, you had one of the most interesting paths to OSINT that we've heard.
Yep. Yeah.
Can you kind of tell us a little bit about that journey, aliens and all?
Aliens. Sure. Yeah. So I'm not your typical OSINT person. So I don't come from a law enforcement background. I don't come from a cybersecurity background and like that. Like I that is not my wheelhouse. I came from journalism. And my origin story is I'll skip over the parts that were boring. At first, I was a teacher for like 12 years. I taught English and history, and I learned that wasn't what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So I started getting into sort of writing, and part of my academic career back in university was in culture studies. So my English background is not actually like in English literature. It's in like cultural studies, so studying how cultures form, how they communicate, how languages form around given cultures, whatever. And my particular interest was in subcultures. So I was really into how sort of predominantly Western subcultures form. So, whether it's like British pop punk subculture in the 1970s or goth culture in the 90s or whatever, that's kind of what I was into. Like, how do these communities organize? How do they start developing their own ideologies and language frameworks and all of that stuff? And a friend of mine, after I'd been teaching for about, 7-8 years, said, hey, I've got a group you should study if you're interested in getting back into this stuff. And I said, sure, yeah, like, lay it on me. Who is it? And he said, you should talk to people who have been abducted by aliens. And I was like,
should I?
Is that? And he was like, listen, it's a hot topic right now. People love the alien stuff. And no one's really done a lot of research into the sort of subcultures that form around like UFOs and aliens and all of that stuff. There's been some, but not a lot. And especially nothing kind of out of Canada and nothing out of sort of a younger kind of, at the time I was young and at the time I was hip, apparently, though you can tell by my clothing choices, maybe not so much anymore. It was like, it's like this would be a very different angle because it's being approached from a sort of a younger person and whatever, not some like stodgy academic who lives in university. And I was like, okay. So I said, sure, I'll give it a shot. So I started talking to people who believed that they were being abducted by aliens. And I wrote a book about it. It's called UFO People. I've made no money on it, so please go buy a copy. And the UFO People was just this sort of subcultural analysis of people who believe in flying saucers and UFOs and alien abduction, all that stuff. But what it quickly led to was getting tapped by places like Vice and Vice Media and Vice Studios, and they were really interested in this topic from a cult perspective. So there's always been sort of UFO cults and alien cults that have existed, but they were kind of becoming quite popular and significantly more robust, especially sort of 2016, 2017. We had sort of the Trump era, QAnon was becoming a big thing. You had kind of the merger of sort of alt-right wing conspiracies and kind of the new age. So UFO cults and aliens and all that stuff became really popular in sort of certain circles. So I was given the job of doing some writing on sort of the UFO subject as it was evolving, researching UFO cults, digging into sort of how they made their money, tracking down people who knew some of these cult leaders prior to them becoming cult leaders. And it led to a whole bunch of documentaries that I worked on, a bunch of articles that I wrote for Vice, as well as some other publications. And that's how I kind of got brought into the OSINT world, because once you start doing those types of investigations, you start bumping into OSINT tools that can help you. So the immediate tool that I was introduced to was Hunchly. And it was like the producer on this documentary was like, listen, if you're doing any research, you got to put it into Hunchly. And I'm like, what's Hunchly? And she showed me how it all worked. And I was like, this is so cool. And I got a license. And this is how I kind of got to know Justin Seitz a little bit. And then from there, it's just sort of like the door opened to this OSINT universe out there that I kind of walked into. And here we are now. So that's the long story to my origin.
Beautiful, winding, UFO-filled world.
It's so freaking bizarre. I know. Like I hear myself tell the story, and I think of the audience being like, "What the hell is going on?" Like, this is the strangest thing. But listen, it is what it is.
So, do you have any other resources, tips, tools that you're dying to share with newbie researchers, or even like newspapers, ones that experienced OSINTers might be overlooking?
Well, I mean, listen, if you don't have a subscription to like Ancestry or newspapers.com, you should, right? Because it's like one of the biggest archives and repositories of this type of stuff. So that's definitely like a thing. And you can use it for free, but just, the paid version is better because you can start like searching and exploring stuff way easier, and it just makes it a million times better. So newspapers.com is like a good place to start because they do have a lot of local press. But the thing I'll say is they don't have everything. And often what I do is I will go to whatever town I think I need to operate out of. And I'll just start kind of like just Google searching like all of the local little community papers that exist in this area. Do the times line up with like the case in question? Like, were they in publication at the time? And then you should start reaching out to archives. Like, I mean, I think Google is like the main tool I use for everything. I just Google it. And nothing fancy, right? You just got to kind of think about, would this have been covered, or would individuals who may know the person or know the thing you're after, like, would that potentially be in the paper? And it's surprising how well it's worked to find people. We were doing a case where we had to find a law enforcement officer who he didn't do anything wrong. We needed to track him down because he may have had information about a particular situation. And he was, long retired, whatever, but he was covered a lot in the local press because he was, being interviewed by journalists for various crimes throughout like the 80s. So, you find his name, you figure out, he got married at one point and then he had kids. And so you're starting to piece together like, okay, this is all showing up in the local paper. This guy's entire sort of life history during like the late 70s into the early 90s. It makes it a lot easier to not necessarily track him down, but if I know his son's name, I can track his son down. Right. Contact the son and be like, hey, and it's like, oh yeah, that's my dad. Yeah, he's like down the road. Hold on. And it's like, he'll like text him, and then he texts me back, and then he calls me, and it's like, hey, are you looking for me? It's like, I am. Wait, hey, like, easy. I just have a question. Like, that's how it, but it, like, this is just so easy to do, but I think it's just thinking in that mindset. From a tools perspective, I don't know. I mean, it depends on your budget. I love a good breach data toolkit that you pay for, like Dehashed or even what's the cheap one? SNUS base or something like that. Those are great little tools to have. But but yeah, it's really tough because we use so many tools, and I get access to tools to try, and then I'll use that for a while, and then I'll buy it or not, just depending on whether I've got my budget line or whether I think it's better than what I'm currently using. So I'm kind of in a weird situation, and a lot of times, to be honest, when you work for Vice or when you work at like Permanent Records, there's money for that, right? Like you can afford that. Whereas if you're a solo operator, you're in a totally different boat. So I don't know, I would love to say like, you should get this tool because it's awesome. I'll give a shout out to OSINT Industries because it's great. And OSINT Industries is really good too, because, Nathan's going to hate me for saying this, but if you tell him you're a journalist, he gives you free access. Sorry, Nathan, I apologize. You get a few credits to use the service, right? Because you're a journalist and you're doing the good work that journalists do. So they're way more willing to share. He's gonna for sure hate me for saying that. Sorry, but yeah, like listen, there's so many good. Forensic OSINT is great from Ritu Gill. Her new sort of it's like Hunchley 2.0. Really cool tool. Love that thing. There's so much. For training, if you're looking for great, inexpensive training, case scenarios, they have some great. It's like $20 and you get like a course. And
we're big fans of case, yeah.
Yeah, and it's not like somebody sits there and is like, this is how you do this type of, this is how you search Facebook. And like, they don't do that. It's like, here's what you got to figure out. If you have questions, go to the Discord server and ask, because that's what OSINT's like in real life. There's no like training there's a thumbs up that just came up. OSINT in real life isn't like some training video. You have to go talk to people who and ask them for help. I don't know how to do everything in OSINT. If I need help, I talk to my team. And if my team doesn't know, I reach out to my sort of broader network and be like, hey, have you ever done this with Gravatar and yanked this type of data from a Gravatar image? And is there a way of doing that? You know what I mean? And people are like, oh, yeah, there's this one. Yeah, you do this. And that's how it is in real life. And case scenarios is great for that because you have to literally have at least some charisma to go into a Discord server and be like, yo, I need help. And they'll help you. Like people are super nice. So there's a lot of great stuff out there. It's just there's like so much of it. I wish I could keep I could go forever.
I think case was like almost bewildering at first because I'm so used to theory and even doing it for the first time, or like I thought it would be all compact, within their system where you don't really leave. And then it was just like, go find the answer. And I was like, oh, me. Oh, I go. Okay.
Yeah, one thing it was a case. They're great. One of the things that really freaked me out was for the purpose of their investigations, they will like plant data out onto the internet, right?
Yeah.
So it's like a real life scavenger hunt in the sense that there's like a Facebook account you have to track down, and it's a Facebook account they made and put out into the universe. Like it's actually out there. Like anyone can go visit it at any time. It doesn't exist in some like contained atmosphere. It's like out there. And at first I was like, this poor man is being just harassed by OSINT people and the case. Like what are you guys doing? Like, is this even legal? And, meanwhile, after 2 minutes, I'm like, oh no, this is totally planted, because I realized like, there's no way this poor man would have so many Facebook Messenger messages. It would be abusive.
I have wondered, and I should ask Ray or Espen, but I've wondered like if they tip off some of these small towns, like this one town in Pennsylvania is just like, what is going on with our Google traffic?
Web
what
traffic
is happening?
Right. Yes, I know. I was going to say this like library that keeps like showing up. I think there's like a library in one of them that you have to like look at the side of it to see like not graffiti, but a mural. I can imagine that library's website has never had more clicks in its life. Like since its establishment,
like we're having
than what Case has sent it there. So this is great. It's good for the small town community. Thanks, Case.
Well, before we go, I know you have a lot of interesting things going on, books, permanent record research. Is there anything you'd like to plug before we wrap up?
Yeah, totally. I mean, there's sort of a few things. The first one is obviously Permanent Record. I mean, we're a brand new consulting advisory firm. We do everything from solving really big problems that are technical to issues over investigations or intelligence gathering. Maybe you've bumped into a wall or a snag and you're not sure what to do. We have some pretty novel and unique ways of thinking about OSINT, whether it's a technical solution or some good old fashioned gumshoeing. And we also have people who can help. So the first thing is Permanent Record. as well as if you're interested in sort of creating content around the OSINT space or intelligence space, or maybe you own a company that does OSINT work or engages in cybersecurity work or something like that, and you're like trying to get your message out there, your story out there, we work in that field as well. So we're sort of masters of OSINT and content. So for sure, I want to plug Permanent Record. If you want to visit the website, it's www.permanentrecordresearch.com.
Link in show notes.
Or a link in show notes. You can also just find me on LinkedIn and shoot me a message. That's the first thing. The second thing is, obviously, it was mentioned earlier in the show, but if you like science and technology, I also co-own a news publication called Debrief.org. But that has nothing really to do with OSINT. It's really more if you're like into nerdy stuff like space propulsion and satellites and exoplanets.
As we are.
It's kind of a news website that my geeky side was like, I love this stuff. And it's not like investigating like the heinous acts that humanity perpetrates upon other members of the species. You know, the Debrief is this nice place that you can like talk about like, oh, we found a new planet. Sweet. So I want to pitch and put the Debrief out there as well. Yeah, otherwise I'm all over the internet. So just, you know, find me on LinkedIn or Twitter or something.
Love it. We will.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for joining us, MJ. It was great talking to you.
It's great. I truly appreciate being on the show. This is a lot of fun.
And thanks so much to our audience for listening. You can view transcripts, links to find MJ and other episode info on our website, authenticate.com/needlestack. That's authentic with the number 8.com/needlestack. Be sure to let us know your thoughts on X, formerly Twitter, or Blue Sky at Needlestack Pod, and to like and subscribe wherever you're listening today. We'll see you next time. Thank you.